Hi, welcome to Talking Text. Our passage is 1 Peter chapter 2 from verse 18. Servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. For this is a gracious thing, when mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. For what credit is it if when you sin and are beaten for it, you endure? But if when you do good and suffer for it, you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example that you might follow in his steps. Peter says to those who are servants, those who have bosses and those over them, it says, would you respect them, give them all respect and honor them. He says, do it not only to those who are good and gentle, but also to those who are unjust, who treat you unjustly. He says, for this is a gracious thing, when mindful of God, one endures sorrows and unjust treatment. Being mindful of God is what makes us able to endure sorrow, to endure unjust treatment. Being mindful of God makes us more gracious. He says, for this is a gracious thing. When you are mindful of God, you're able to do this. And he says there's no credit if you sin and endure the punishment of that sin or that wrongdoing. But when you do good and are treated unjustly, he says this is a very gracious thing in the sight of God. He reminds his readers that everything is in the sight of God. There is nothing that is hidden from God's sight. And so to suffer unjustly is not a problem for the believer, because he knows ultimately God is his justice and God sees all things. And one day Jesus will make all things beautiful and perfect again. And so we put our trust and our hope in God's justice, not our own. And we are able to be gracious. I wonder if you've ever been treated unjustly. And I wonder if you can think about your response and how gracious you were, or maybe weren't. And so he says this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. In fact, he goes a step further. He says, for to this you have been called. Not only is it how we ought to think and believe, but he says actually you're called to this. He says, because Christ suffered for you, leaving you his example. Jesus was unjustly treated. In fact, he was perfect, blameless, without sin, as Peter described earlier. And yet he suffered unjustly that we might receive the grace and the forgiveness that comes from him and the forgiveness of our sins. And so Jesus is the example that he urges us to follow, that we might walk in his steps. I want to encourage you, if you've ever been treated unjustly, to take it to God, to become mindful of God. That will that'll help you to become more gracious, and to consider Jesus, who was treated unjustly, which means that actually I can put my hope and my trust in his justice, not my own, and to follow in Jesus' footsteps. Hope you've been blessed, and thanks for letting the text talk.